the most likely outcome for Putin is going to be he'll want to be seen negotiating, but he will not want to make any real substantial concessions because I think his war aims remain unchanged.
Is peace finally within reach for Ukraine? Yesterday, negotiators in Saudi Arabia struck a deal to have a 30-day truce. Now the ball is in Putin's court. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's assistant editor, and today to discuss this, I'm joined by the Cold War historian Sergey Radchenko and my colleague Svitlana Morenets, author of the Ukraine in Focus newsletter. Sergey and Svitlana, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, Sergey, just to start with you, how do you read this proposed truce? Is it a climb down from Ukraine, given that no security guarantees have yet been agreed?
To a certain extent, yes, because the Ukrainians first proposed not a complete truce, but just the cessation of military action in the air and on sea. So they agreed to this in return for America providing them with intelligence and military supplies. Both in fact have been frozen by the Trump administration, but now Trump has agreed, or the Americans have agreed, to reopen those lines for the time being, and so the Ukrainians have agreed to a general truce.
And Svitlana, is that how you read it as well? That this is President Zelensky kind of stepping back from what he would have wanted to get out of the US? This is not the ideal.
Yes, but it was important for Ukraine to show that the country is not the obstacle to peace, and now it's up to Russia to prove that to Trump, because considering the relationship that has been between Zelensky and Trump recently, Ukraine had to make at least that concession to show that they are ready to talk.
One line that both Europeans and Ukrainian officials seem to have been using is that the ball is now in Putin's court. Mm-hmm. Is there almost an element of, trying to call his bluff, saying the Americans keep saying that Russia wants peace. And so now the Ukrainians, by agreeing to this truce, are saying, well, show us, we're happy for peace.
Of course, and now Putin has to choose between continuing his war effort in Ukraine or keeping his good relationship with Trump, what is more important to him.
Yes. And Sergey, what do you think? Could Putin actually say no or put some conditions on this truce? Does he have any room for that rejection?
So there are two possibilities. First of all, we have Putin himself fairly recently, in December of last year, talking about truce. And what he said in his remarks was that if you agree to truce, this will allow the other side to rearm, an opportunity to regroup or dig in, etc. And so this was not in Russia's benefit at the time when Russia is making gains on the battlefield. So that's on the one hand. He mentioned something like this last December. On the other hand, he has also repeatedly said that Russia is in favor of negotiating, although he has conditioned that negotiation with references to Zelensky's removal from power and so on and so forth. So in my view, the most likely outcome for Putin is going to be he'll want to be seen negotiating, but he will not want to make any real substantial concessions because I think his war aims remain unchanged.
When you say no substantial concessions, does that mean Putin will say, okay, let's consider this? But what counts as a concession in this case? Because 30-day truce along the current lines already seems quite positive for Russia, doesn't it?
Well, I think it's not what Putin wants. He wants much greater gains in Ukraine. He effectively wants to control Ukraine, politically control Ukraine. What he wants is a return to something like Istanbul, the negotiations that took place in Istanbul in the spring of 2022, which would entail a permanent neutrality for Ukraine, i.e. no NATO membership, demilitarization, i.e. a very limited military force that Ukraine would be allowed, and a number of other issues. And of course, also he wants to control the territories that he has already formally annexed but still does not control. So those, I think, are going to be his minimum demands, so to speak, regardless of the kind of negotiations that he goes into. The question is whether he will agree to truce now maybe just a temporary truce. In his earlier comments, he seemed to suggest that if it's just a very short period, that perhaps he could agree to that. But as we can see, we haven't had the Russian reaction yet. But what the Russians are trying to do now is to make maximum gains that they can on the battlefield, push Ukrainians out of Kursk, for example. That is something that they're trying to accomplish even now. The big question is whether then they will agree to pause in order to consider whether the Americans are likely to arm twist President Zelensky into agreeing to something like Istanbul or not. If the Russians pause, then we'll see another period of diplomatic activity.
I think Putin is more likely to agree to this temporal truce right now because of his troops that are currently rapidly advancing in the Kursk region. And before, it was the main obstacle for Putin to agree to this temporary ceasefire because he didn't want Ukrainian soldiers being on the Russian land. And now in the coming days, most likely Ukrainians will retreat from the region, and Putin will then present it as a victory to the Russian people, that Russian land was liberated, and then he will say yes to the temporary ceasefire. But also I'm convinced he will ask for the partial sanctions relief from Trump as in exchange for him agreeing to the ceasefire.
And Svitlana, how do you read the drone strikes that Ukraine has hit Russia with, in particular Moscow, over 90 drone strikes on Tuesday night? Is that a negotiating tactic in this context?
I think it's just a show of strength to show that even with American aid, Ukraine is still capable of inflicting significant damage on Russia because of the mass production of drones that is currently happening in Ukraine.
Sergey, I guess it's anyone's guess if Putin comes back and negotiates what Trump will react with, because he has shown incredible largesse in the way that he's talked about Putin rather than Zelensky. So I wonder if this American president will actually see that as a bit of a disrespect, that he's managed to get the Ukrainians around the table and it wasn't easy, and now Putin, you're coming back here and throwing the steel back in my face.
Well, obviously, Putin values his relationship with Trump, but I think he values his gains in Ukraine even more. He began this war because he wanted to control Ukraine politically, and he wanted to project a certain message to Russia's neighbors that Russia is quote unquote back and should not be messed with. And I think he will try to accomplish those goals regardless of what Trump puts on the table in the form of some ceasefire deal or something like that, because he has already built up his war economy. He has spent a huge amount of blood and treasure on this war. Will he stop now and just be happy with what he has in strip of land in eastern Ukraine? I'm not sure if this is actually the case. I think what he will try to do is he will try to gain politically what he could not gain through military force, i.e. he will try to come around to a situation where the Americans will do the work for him and will be arm twisting President Zelensky to agree to something like an Istanbul scenario, going back to the spring of 2022, which would weaken Ukraine tremendously and make it much easier for the Russians to control Ukraine indirectly, as well as actually control the territories that they have formally annexed.
Now, of course, Svitlana, what's missing from the current agreement is the idea of security guarantees. Now, the US National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, did say that it did come up as a part of a discussion on a permanent future. Do we know what might be possible on the table, or is it just too far down the line to predict?
Maybe it's too early to say what they're preparing, but Rubio today said that the minerals deal with Ukraine should not be considered as a security guarantee for Ukraine. So it's quite the opposite what Trump's administration had been saying for the last 2 weeks.
Yes.
And Zelensky was denying it. He said it's not the security guarantee. I think the European allies agreeing how many troops they are ready to send to Ukraine, what weapons they are ready to send to Ukraine. It will show us how really they are determined to bring real security for Ukraine. But also, I would say the Ukrainian army is the best security guarantee for Ukraine. And if there is a ceasefire, then European allies should focus on strengthening Ukraine's defense capabilities, sending more weapons and more air defenses. I also want to add that there is a danger in the ceasefire with Russia, that it just prolongs into another ceasefire and another ceasefire without a real peace deal. And in that period of time, Russia could use this disinformation and all those campaigns to destabilize Ukrainian political situation. Also, the soldiers who have been fighting for over 3 years, they would want to go home and have some rest. And maybe there will be calls for elections from the US and Russia. So it will be very difficult for Ukraine to live through those ceasefires. That's why Zelensky was insisting that security guarantees should be forced, that Putin won't just renew the fighting in any convenient for him moment.
Yes. And Sergey, the US administration right now seems convinced that if there was an election that Zelensky would lose. At least that's what Elon Musk seems to be tweeting on the hoof anyway. Is that true? And especially after that Oval Office bust-up, has Zelensky's popularity taken a hit?
I don't think that from the Ukrainian polls we can draw those conclusions quite yet. Clearly, the Trump administration have considered Zelensky to be an obstacle to peace, just as the Russians have. And there's a certain meeting of minds, or there has been in the last few weeks about this notion that perhaps Zelensky should step aside and allow somebody else take the wheel, so to speak. But that's been a long time, Putin obsession. He has long refused to negotiate with Zelensky, and he has called Zelensky illegitimate, and so on and so forth. So when recently President Trump also joined this sort of narrative that was being peddled by Putin, I was surprised. But of course, President Trump is known for sharp reversals. If you can say one saying, call Zelensky dictator and unelected, etc., on one day, and the next day seek to strike a deal with him. So I don't know that that President Trump will try to move any further on the road to delegitimize Zelensky or remove him from office. And in fact, even if he did that, I'm not sure that he has the necessary leverage to prevail. I mean, how do you even see that? America trying to remove an actually elected president of Ukraine, democratically elected president, acting together with Russia to remove him because they think he's an obstacle to peace. I don't see this working out. But it seems, at least from the recent discussions in Saudi Arabia, that the Americans have kind of patched up their relations with the Ukrainians, at least for the time being, and seem to be, at least briefly, on the same page.
And I will let you both go very soon. But Svitlana, just finally, Keir Starmer has been lauded almost as one of the leading diplomats in Europe, or at least in the European response to Trump's negotiations. Do you think the Prime Minister here has had much of a role in the situation that we are in today? Can he take any credit?
Of course, and he should. And as we know, Keir Starmer has been advising Zelensky how to deal with Trump prior these negotiations that led to American aid being resumed for Ukraine, which was very successful negotiation. And also, I think that the UK has shown such an important role in these 3 years of war, because Britain was the first to send heavy armored tanks to Ukraine, then all of the Europe followed, the first to send long-range missiles, and then all of the Europe followed. And the same goes with this peacekeeping mission, that Britain shows the lead and then all the Europe follows, and hopefully they can agree on something substantial.
Well, I can imagine Boris Johnson not being very pleased that Keir Starmer is taking more of the limelight now. Sergey Radchenko and Svitlana Morenets, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.